Okay, so today we're going to talk about DNA and chromosomes. It's going to be a really good lesson building off of what we had talked about before the Easter break. Let's get started. So we're going to discuss the components and the functions of DNA today. We're going to talk about chromosomes, we're going to talk about genes, and we're going to talk about heritable genes as well. The lesson is going to build totally off of what we learned before. Let's get rolling. So for cells, I want to remind you that in Science 8 you learned the parts of a cell. You might recall that the control center of a cell is the nucleus. The nucleus, which is right here, is the control center of the cell. So basically that's the part of the cell that's issuing all of the commands and orders, and it's making it actually determine what's going on. So if you wanted an analogy, the nucleus of a cell is like a brain on a person. Now this control center contains the genetic material, which is called the DNA, right? DNA is the genetic material of any living thing. It's what carries the information as to what that living thing is going to be like. And that, of course, is again found in the nucleus. So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. You don't need to know that. That's just kind of for your information. It's the inherited material responsible for variation, and it's found in all living things in the nucleus of each cell. Now, DNA needs to reproduce itself. It must move from parent to offspring. And again, it controls all the structures and functions of the cells. So in other words, DNA is basically the building block of any living thing. This right here is, of course, showing the structure of DNA. We'll get into that a little bit more in a second. But you notice that DNA is like a spirally strand that has a bunch of links that connect each of those strands together. So DNA contains 4 bases. That's what those links are. They're adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. The arrangement of these bases form the entire genetic code. So in other words, the order at which these bases are linked up forms a code that more or less determines how that organism is going to appear, how they're going to act, and any of the features that exist within that species. Now, adenine will always link with thymine, and cytosine will always link with guanine. So in other words, you always have an AT link and a CG link, or vice versa, right? Those 2 bases will always pair with the other base. Now the backbone, so the strand part on the outside here, is made up of a sugar-phosphate repeating pattern. So it's like sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, and it forms this whole link strand here. On this picture, I just called it a phosphate backbone, but really it is sugar and phosphate. Now the structure of DNA is known as a double helix. That's the name of the shape of it. It's similar in shape to a ladder that's been twisted, right? So if you look at this as if it was a ladder that someone took by the ends here and then twisted it around, that forms a double helix, and all of these base pairs form like the little rungs of the ladder. Now, chromosomes. Chromosomes are packages of DNA, so like there are a lot of DNA strands all strung together in a chromosome. So chromosomes are packages of DNA that are found in the cell nucleus. Chromosomes are organized in pairs, right? So they don't just exist on their own. Well, they do, but they really organize themselves into pairs. But with one chromosome is being inherited by your mother or from your mother, and the other is from your father. Now, humans have 46 chromosomes, or in other words, 23 pairs, because 46 divided by 2 is 23, in each cell nucleus. So every single one of your cells, more or less, there's some exceptions to this, but every single one of your cells will have 46 chromosomes in it, or in other words, 23 pairs. Just in case you're wondering, other species will have different numbers of chromosomes. Dogs have 78 chromosomes, which in other words would make 39 pairs, and cats have 38 chromosomes, or in other words, 19 pairs, because both of those numbers divided by 2 gives them the pair number. So again, all of these pairs are found in each cell nucleus, and again, a normal human being is going to have 46 chromosomes. Now there are some genetic differences where some people will actually have an extra chromosome. In case you're not aware, when someone has an extra chromosome, so if they had one more chromosome than most other humans would, that actually forms the condition called Down syndrome. So Down syndrome is a syndrome that forms from having an extra chromosome. Sex chromosomes. Now of these 23 pairs, one of the pairs, so 2 chromosomes, are called sex chromosomes, which determine whether you're biologically male or female. Now individually, so each one of these chromosomes, they're called X chromosomes and Y chromosomes. Now remember, you get 1 chromosome from each parent for every chromosome pair, right? So you get 23 from one parent and 23 from the other that form those 23 pairs of chromosomes. Now for the sex chromosomes, of course, that's no different. You're going to be getting one chromosome, one of these, either an X or a Y from one of your parents, and either an X or Y from another one of your parents. Now here's the weird thing about the sex chromosomes is women, for their sex chromosomes, they carry two X chromosomes, whereas men, they have an X and a Y. So what happens is when these chromosomes are passed, again, you get one from your mother and one from your father. Your mother has no choice but to pass on one of her X chromosomes, because those are the only sex chromosomes that she has. So whether you're a female child or a male child, you're getting an X chromosome from your mother one way or another. But of course, your father, because he has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, he could pass either one of those. And again, it's just a 50-50 chance, it's just random, but he'll pass either one of those. If you get an X chromosome from your mother and an X chromosome from your father, you're going to be female, right? Because you'll have two X chromosomes yourself. However, if you get one of the X chromosomes from your mother and the Y chromosome from your father, that will make you male, right? So you'll have an XY pair like any other man would, right? So again, both parents pass on an X, you're female. If one parent passes on an X, in other words, your mother would have to pass that one, and your father passes a Y, then you will be male. Now for genes, we discussed earlier this unit about genes. Genes are a segment of DNA which contains the coded instructions, right? So DNA is the whole link of what makes you who you are, right? So in other words, it's your basically your blueprint, right? Genes are just a segment of that. This picture was about as good as I could find. If we had, it actually shows everything we need. We have a cell, there's a nucleus. Inside the nucleus, we got our chromosome here. The chromosome is a big package of DNA. So if you were to string it all out, you have a big strand of DNA there, and just one little segment of that big strand of DNA is a gene, right? So a gene is just a segment of the DNA. So your genes are located on chromosomes. Each chromosome has many gene locations, and these genes also come in pairs. Now, I want you to remember this whole idea that genes coming in pairs shouldn't be a new piece of information to us, because remember, when we're talking about genotypes and phenotypes, if you had a hair color genotype of, let's say, BB, capital B, lowercase b, remember that capital B is your dominant brown hair allele, which is one part of a gene pair, and the lowercase b is the recessive blonde hair allele. Now, due to the dominant being present, you would have brown hair. But what I'm getting at here is because genes come in pairs, these pairs, of course, being each allele, you're going to have either a dominant or a recessive within each of these gene locations. Anyway, moving on. Heritable genes. Now, how this all kind of ties together here is that some characteristics are only passed on certain chromosomes. Okay, so in other words, certain chromosomes will carry certain genes, and those genes are what gets passed on, as a heritable characteristic from your parents, right? Here's a bit of an extreme example. I'm using this one because your textbook uses it as well, although I found a better picture than what your textbook had. For example, a rare disease called severe combined immunodeficiency, or SCID. Much easier to say that, SCID, which results in a very weak immune system, is passed on the X chromosome. Now, by a very weak immune system, in case you're not aware what that means, it basically just means that your body's not going to be able to fight off any diseases or infections. So even a common cold could end up being a crippling disease to you if you have a very weak immune system, right? Because naturally, we have a common cold, our body fights against it, and eventually, after a week or so, we get better, right? But someone with this kind of an immune system, not so much. So David Vetter, that was this boy right here. He was known by the public, because he was quite well known in the media, of course, as the Bubble Boy. And of course, he was called the Bubble Boy because he lived in a bubble, right? And the reason he lived in a bubble is because he had SCID. And he actually only lived from 1971 to 1984. He died before his 13th birthday. So it did have a tragic end to it. But again, because of this disease, which was passed on the X chromosome, he had no real immune system, so he had to live in a plastic bubble, basically. That's kind of a funny way of putting it, but it was better said as a plastic containment system, right? They had ways of getting things into him as long as they were disinfected and all that. But again, he had to live here, otherwise just any illness, like again, even a common cold, could have proved fatal to him. I believe how he eventually passed away was he needed a bone transplant or something. And then he got an infection from it or something. I can't remember the full details. If you're interested, you could always look him up, David Vetter. He was in the media quite a bit in the 70s and 80s. Not that I would remember. I wasn't alive in the 70s, but still an interesting story nonetheless. Again, it is an extreme one. There's several other things that can be passed on, X chromosomes or Y chromosomes, certain characteristics or certain genetic disorders. But this one is a really extreme example. And of course, unfortunately, not to pin any blame on anyone, because again, you can't control what genes you have. But with David, of course, being male, he would have an X and a Y chromosome. And since this disease is passed on an X chromosome, unfortunately, that means he would have had to inherit it from his mother, because that would be the only chromosome that would have been passed on. Not that it, again, is her fault or anything, because she wouldn't be able to control that either. So we're actually done for today. That was a really quick lesson, only about 10 minutes long. For practice, I want you to do page 45, questions 1 to 4, question 7, and question 8. So you got tons of time to do this if we stick within our normal half-hour a day. Again, if you have any questions from this, send me an email or send me a message on Google Classroom. I'm more than willing to help you out on that one. You don't need to send these questions in to me. I know some of you have been, and I've been really appreciative of seeing that at least. But I'm not taking these and I'm not collecting them. These are for your own practice, but it would be very unwise to not do these questions. So please make sure they are getting done. Anyway, again, if you need any help, you know how to contact me. Best of luck. Talk to you soon.